Good afternoon, guys. We just have a few sections here. We're going to do it in one big PowerPoint. You guys can pause and take breaks as you need. Don't panic about having to do all these at the same time. So we're going to kind of do Chapter 16 pretty quick so that we can get into the rise of totalitarian leaders that lead us up to World War II. So we're going to start off with nationalism in the Middle East. So we are looking at the time period after World War I and before World War II, so between the years of 1919 and 1939. So, first, we already know, we've talked about it several times, the Ottoman Empire was already in decline, but it falls after World War I with the Treaty of Versailles. So what were the factors in the decline of the Ottoman Empire? First, loss of territory. During the 1800s, the Ottoman Empire had been continually losing their territory that was in Europe and in North Africa. Second, they were having struggles with their constitution. In 1876, some reformers set up a constitutional monarchy, but the Sultan suspended the constitution, so there were no changes. And then there was a rebel group known as the Young Turks. They forced the restoration of the Constitution in 1908, deposing or getting rid of the Sultan in 1909. However, they did not have strong support for their government, so it did not work quite as they had planned. Alright, so here we see some of the area that was former Ottoman lands. That lighter orange are the former lands that were lost before 1914, and everything that is that darker orange, that was the land of the Ottoman Empire starting in 1914, so before the World War I began. Losses in World War I, those are going to be another major factor. The British supported nationalist activities in an attempt to kind of undermine the Ottoman rule. Arabia declares independence in 1916, and the British take over Palestine during the war. We also have an Armenian genocide occur during World War I. It's not something that's talked about too much, but the Ottoman Turks committed a genocide against a smaller community, a smaller ethnic group, the Armenians. And sometime between 1914 and 1918, nearly 1.5 million Armenians were either killed by the Ottoman soldiers or died after deportation. So I want you to just think about this. Why do you think the Allied forces failed to intervene in the Armenian genocide? So we know that the Ottoman Empire was a central power. So why did the Allies, why did the United States, Britain, France not get involved? Think about this. We'll talk about it in class. Alright, we also see other changes in the Middle East. We see modernization and we see nationalism come together. Modernization of Turkey. Turkey was once part of the Ottoman Empire. It is the only and was the only Ottoman-controlled territory left after World War I. Ataturk, who was a war hero during World War I, helped lead to the creation of a Turkish Republic, and this Turkish Republic is what replaces Ottoman rule, replaces the Ottoman Empire. He reduces the influence of Islam, helping to make Turkey a secular state, a secular country, meaning a country that is not ruled by religion. And he introduces other Western practices, something even as simple as the Western alphabet. In Iran is another country in the Middle East. We see Iranian government wanting help, and we also see a discovery of oil, and this leads to a significant number of foreigners coming into Iran. We have the Persian king Reza Khan becomes the Shah, and he introduces reforms to modernize the government, military, and economy, but he doesn't do anything to reduce the influence of Islam. So today even, Iran is actually considered a theocracy. In 1935, Persia, what was Persia, becomes officially known as Iran, and Reza Khan aligns the country with Nazi Germany, which probably not the best choice. Saudi Arabia, another Middle Eastern country, through mandates. Europeans then are the ones who officially determine the Arab nations' borders in Saudi Arabia. We have reform leader Ibn Saud. He helps unite the Arabs in the Northern Arabian Peninsula in the 1920s. And in 1939, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia is established. And again, today, it is still a kingdom. There is still a king of Saudi Arabia. The new kingdom was very poor until we see the United States getting involved and British getting involved in the Persian Gulf region in 1938, where they struck oil. Oil is a big influence in why Western countries get themselves involved in the Middle East. And it's also the Western countries getting themselves involved in the Middle East does not help the tension which we know in the Middle East today. So when we're talking about these new companies coming in, I mean, I'm sure we've all heard of BP. BP stands for British Petroleum, and British Petroleum was the oil company that was founded in the Middle East by Britain. Okay, so moving on. So discussion questions, I want you guys to think about: what role did nationalism play in the modernization of Turkey and Iran? What role did this idea of unifying their ethnic groups play? And how has the discovery of oil in Iran and Arabia continued to affect the region and the world today? All right, so Palestine. Palestine, that we don't really know Palestine. The Palestine that we know is now called Israel. And there's a lot of tensions that occur that are still in Palestine because of the difference between the Jewish and the Arab Muslims. So historically, Palestine was the ancient home of the Jews, but after the 1st century AD, many of these Jews had been forced out. Early in the 1900s, we have about 80% of the population that are Arab Muslims. So we have a large Muslim majority. But the Jewish and the Arab nationalism conflicted because both groups saw Palestine as their national state, as their chosen territory that they had a right to have. And again, even today, we still see conflict there. So starting in the 1890s, we see a Zionist movement which calls for a Jewish state in Palestine. And we see there's Zionism and anti-Semitism in Europe. The anti-Semitism in Europe that we see happening in the 1930s that helps lead and pushes Jewish people to migrate to Palestine. To gain Jewish support during World War I, the British supported the Zionists' desire for a homeland, for a Jewish homeland, and they pushed the Balfour Declaration. And the Balfour Declaration basically forms this idea of international support for a modern state of Israel. So no more Palestine, but an Israel. It expressed support for a national home for the Jews in Palestine, but even though it doesn't seem like it's followed through, it also added that the goal should not undermine the rights of the non-Jewish peoples who are living there. But when the non-Jewish people are informed that they have to give up at least a portion of their country, we see violence break out between these Jewish people and the Muslims. So, in what ways did the actions of the British contribute to the ongoing struggle that we see in Palestine or Israel today? Alright, so like I said, I'm moving pretty quick, so make sure you write down any questions that you might have, anything that you're not certain that I'm talking about, so that you can ask me in class tomorrow. Now we're moving into Africa and Asia. We already know about the imperialism that was occurring. We already know with this imperialism we have these different ethnic groups that want this self-determination. So after World War I, we start to see some fights for this begin. Alright, so looking at this map of Africa before World War I, this should look very familiar. Africa in 1914. We see that the majority of the territory in Africa is taken over by Britain and France in 1914. So the change that we would expect to see after World War I ends has to deal with one of those major provisions of the Treaty of Versailles, the major provision that takes away the German territories, the German colonies in Africa, and divides them up between the Allies. So we will see some changes on the map there. Okay, so once World War I ends, a lot of Africans see this as a potential to start fighting and a potential to end the colonial rule. So many of the Africans who volunteered to fight with Britain and France hoped that Britain and France would be kind enough to give them independence after World War I ends. Germany, again, loses all of its African colonies, and Britain and France had control to administer them, to divide them up as mandates for the League of Nations, which was created also with the Treaty of Versailles after World War I. So educated Africans begin calling for freedom and nationalism, and we see new reform movements that, of course, are going to differ throughout all of Africa, because Africa is a very big continent with a lot of different attributes, a lot of different tribes, a lot of different cultures. We see a lot of new leaders emerging, influenced by African American thinkers, one of which would be W.E.B. Du Bois, who was an African American educated in Harvard. He led a movement that pushed for all Africans to become aware of their own cultural heritage. And then we also have Marcus Garvey, who was originally Jamaican. He moved to Harlem, and he emphasized Pan-Africanism. The idea behind Pan-Africanism is that all Africans would be united as Africans. So these ideas, even though they're based in the Americas, are actually transferred through these educated Africans into the African colonies. So, in what ways did European nations help bring about nationalist movements in Africa? So we just want to think about what is it that the European countries did that would make the Africans push for that self-determination and that self-rule. All right, Asia, spreading communism in Asia. We already know 1917 we have the Russian Revolution. This example that occurs where we see communism succeeding in Russia shows Southeast Asians that revolution is and was possible. We also see communism being spread by the communists in Russia, which spurs part of the Cold War, which we'll talk about when we get to the 1950s. Lenin founds a group called the Communist International, or Comintern for short, with the idea that these Cominterns would go into other countries and help advance and push for these communist revolutions to occur in other countries. And then we also have other agents from other countries coming to Moscow, training with the Comintern, and then returning home to form communist parties. And one of those leaders was Ho Chi Minh. Ho Chi Minh helped organize the Vietnamese communists, and he worked for a very powerful worked with a very powerful communist organization in China as well. And again, Ho Chi Minh is somebody that we will definitely touch back on when we get to the end of World War II. Vietnam is under French control at this time during World War I and after World War I. So we'll see after World War II, we will see the French weaken and Ho Chi Minh rise up and try to help free Vietnam and make them a communist country. Alright, so just so you guys have some idea of where I'm talking about, you can see Vietnam right below China. And where we were talking about the Middle East earlier, those are going to be towards the left side of the screen. We'll see Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Syria, Turkey, Israel, Lebanon, Cyprus. Those are all important when we're talking about the Middle East, as well as Afghanistan. Alright, so just study this, get it in your mind, so that when I talk about a country it might help. Also, remember you can always rewind to look back if you're not really sure where I'm referring to. So, why do you think the Comintern wanted to spread communism outside of Russia? If we think about what Karl Marx discussed with the rise of the proletariat in his book, The Communist Manifesto, one of the ideas that he pushed was this concept of a worldwide revolution. And if Lenin is a Marxist, he is going to want to push forward these ideas that Marx holds. Okay, so moving back to India, we've talked about India a couple times already this year. We talked about Mohandas Gandhi and his push for nonviolent resistance and civil disobedience. After World War I, that is when Gandhi really starts to organize these mass nonviolent protests, getting him imprisoned. And many times when he was imprisoned, he would go on hunger strikes and practically starve himself near death until he was able to get what he felt was necessary. He encouraged civil disobedience, like we discussed, and boycotting British goods, which is another efficient method of protest. If Indians are not purchasing British goods, then the British are losing money. And it can be money is a very effective motivator. We discussed a couple chapters ago about the differences with the Indians and the Hindus and the Muslims in India. We have some issues between Hindus and Muslims, and we also have some issues with peaceful and violent approaches. So obviously we know Gandhi is a very peaceful approach, this calm method. And then we have Jawaharlal Nehru, who is focused very much more on secular, Western ideas, modern approach. We see a lot of violence break out that we do still periodically hear about today between Indian Hindus and Muslims. And he calls, Jawaharlal Nehru specifically calls for a separate Muslim state, which will eventually become true after the emancipation of India. So Pakistan will be taken from India after World War II. So why did the difference in Gandhi's and Nehru's approach create more uncertainty about India's path to independence? If we have one strong leader who is pushing for a religious, peaceful, nonviolent approach, and then another leader who's pushing for a more modern, more westernized, more forward and aggressive approach, we're going to see that conflict occur not just between the leaders but also between the citizens. Okay, so Japan. Japan will help lead us also into World War II. Pretty much everything we're talking about will either lead us into World War II or be affected after World War II. So, Japan was actually pretty peaceful except for to China and the place it was imperializing. And as we know, Japan did join the side of the Allies during World War I. But we start to see an end to these peaceful policies. The Zaibatsu system starts to change, and there are economic inequalities. So we have a very few large corporations that have most of the control of most of the companies in 1900s, which is going to cause some serious economic inequalities. And these economic inequalities cause people to want a return to tradition. Just like we will see in Germany, the return to tradition is going to be, the idea of a return to tradition is going to be a big motivating factor leading a country to become fascist or very strongly conservative. We see Japan's relations with Western nations changing. Japan continues to take over territories that have raw materials. As they keep continuing to imperialize, the Western countries, Europe and the United States, start to become a little concerned. In the 1930s, we see the formation of extreme patriotic organizations in Japan. By 1931, we see Japan going into Manchuria, which is an area in Chinese territory, which was taken without the government approving. The military just went and did it themselves. The government really didn't have a lot of power, and the military quickly dominates the government. So why do you think that the Western countries would be concerned with Japan's desire to imperialize? Just think about the idea of if Japan gets too much land and gets too much power, the thought of the Western powers possibly not being able to keep them all under control. That's going to be pretty concerning. Okay, so very quickly we are now moving to China. So in China, we see nationalist leader Sun Yat-sen, which we've talked about very briefly earlier. He leads the Chinese to become a republic in the early 1900s. Then we also see Chiang Kai-shek, or you'll also see him, again, depending on the textbook, we've talked about this before, as Jiang Zeshi. And he leads the Chinese Nationalist Party after Sun Yat-sen loses control. And he becomes the head of the Chinese national government from 1928 to 1949. Then we have Mao Zedong, or again we'll see it Mao Zedong, Zedong, or we will also see it Mao Zedong, Tse-Tung, the same person. And also he will be referred to as Mao, and I know it's kind of confusing, but in a lot of Asian countries, the surname, or what we consider the last name, is that actually comes first. So we're still using his last name but it happens to come first in Asian countries. He is a Chinese communist leader, and eventually in 1949 he will form the People's Republic of China. Alright, so those people we're going to need to keep in mind after World War II is over. Then we will get to nationalism in Latin America. Like I said, this is a speed run, guys. If you have questions, please, please, please make sure you write them down. Ask me tomorrow, ask me whenever, send me an email, and I will do everything I can to help clarify. Alright, so the last section, talking about Latin America. We already know the Latin American economy is highly influenced by foreign investments, relies very heavily on exports of farm products and of raw materials. We know U.S. investors are putting a lot of money into production facilities in Latin America, which in a sense gives the United States imperial power because they have economic domination of Latin America. We see a lot of Latin Americas start to consider U.S. control of industries as a form of imperialism, and they want to change it. So in the 1930s, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who is the President of the United States from 1933 all the way until 1945, he gives out this idea of a good neighbor policy, and basically to try to put their minds at ease while still maintaining economic control, states that no military force will be used in Latin America by the United States government. So when the Great Depression hits in 1929, the United States and European economies are both weakened. We tend to think about the United States as being the only one really affected by the Great Depression, but we have started a global economy where there's a lot of trading and buying and selling among countries. So when the Great Depression hits the United States, the Great Depression hits everybody. And this decreases the demand for Latin American exports, which lessens the amount of money that they're making off of the Americans. Because of this economic instability that happens as a result of the Great Depression, this opens up the way and paves the way for military dictators to take control and for authoritarian rule to occur in several Latin American countries. Okay, guys, I know it was a speed run. I just gave you 4 sections in a half an hour. Tell me what you got questions on. Anything you need, let me know. I will gladly help you. Hopefully, as we discuss in class, it might clarify some of this. I really need you to just know the absolute basics for this, because as soon as we're done with this and we're done with this section, we are moving straight into the rise of totalitarian leaders. All right, have a great night, guys. We'll see you at school.